Okay, thank you very much. So the last speaker is me, so I am going to talk on this subject matter. Thank you very much. Let me see. Okay. Yes. Before we start, you see this photo, and this is from the ATCM back in I don't know 20 years ago, and I'm sitting here speaking, and next to me is actually Professor Patrizia Vini representing Italy. So my talk today is based on some of my experiences from attending the ATCMs long before, almost 20 years ago, and also from my 20 years of legal studies on the ATCM, with a little bit of some information from other sources. In June of 2021, we held the first PCRC Antarctic Symposium, and in Japanese at that time. And that was, of course, before the Ukraine war. And I did comprehensively pose the challenges that will be facing Japan hosting the ATCM in 2026. And I have listed them in this slide. I will not go to the details of them altogether, but let me just go over them. The first issue that I mentioned at the time, before the Ukraine war, was the US, European countries versus China, Russia with regard to the marine protected areas under the CAMLA. And this has not changed at this moment. But I also added one question to ourselves. What is the role of Japan in this? And according to my view, I think there are a much more an intimate interactions between those two conferences, the ATCM and the CAMLA, even though those conferences are held in a different time, in a different places. But according to my view, I think those two issues must be dealt together in order to have a comprehensive, effective Antarctic governance policies. The next issue that I mentioned was the transparency of Antarctic activities, and Antarctic Treaty provides a very good mechanism for that under the Article 3 and 7. This is the information exchange and inspections. And there are certain doubts with regard to some of the hidden activities, claimed hidden activities like bioprospecting, like commercial ones, and claimed military activities in Antarctica. But according to my view, with the strengthened transparency in the Antarctic governance using the existing mechanisms under Article 3 and 7, I think we can address those issues. The third was the science-based decision-making, obstructed, according to some people, by consensus, and I'll come back to this one later on. The fourth was the claimed slow lawmaking process, and I mentioned one example of that, taking up the liability Annex 6. And this is actually an slow approval process of this annex, which was adopted in 2005, but has not become effective today. But if you look at the out of 28 consultative parties needed to approve this one in order to make it effective, there are still 9 consultative parties who have not approved it. And amongst those 9, 4 are from Asia. Actually, almost all the consultative parties from Asia: Japan, India, Korea, and China. Those 4 countries are not still approving it. So maybe in the future, towards 2026, those Asian countries can have some kind of dialogue amongst themselves in order to make this Annex 6 effective by the time Japan hosts the ATCM in 2026. And also, from this perspective, it's very interesting looking towards 5 years from now, within 5 years, that we are going to have India hosting the ATCM in 2024, Japan in 2026, and then following Japan is Korea in 2027. So we have 3 hosts, Asian hosts, coming up in 5 years. So I think we can bring up some Asian agenda into the ATCM using those 3 hosts more effectively and collaboratively. And of course, a collaboration from China would also be very beneficial in this regard. The fifth one that I mentioned was the openness of governance, and I will come back to this one, especially with regard to the consultative party acknowledgement criteria. The sixth, was it? The sixth issue that I mentioned was the balance between science and environment. We see larger facilities, larger stations, larger or more, gravel, for example, airstrips in Antarctica, and wharves in Antarctica. And there should be some discussion on this balance between scientific facilities and the environment. Eighth was the seventh, I forgot, the resources. There was a shock again when China hosted ATCM in 2017. The conference theme was entitled "Our Antarctica: Protection and Utilization," and the word utilization shocked many people. However, if you look at Japan, we do also, be based on our Antarctic policy very much on sustainable use. Of course, thinking of the fisheries first of all, but would it, for Japan, that this principle of sustainable use would also be applicable to other resources in Antarctica? That has not been clear from the Japanese government. The last point that I mentioned in 2021 was the possibility of truly international Antarctic cooperation. And I raised one example of such a potential, making Showa Station as an Asian Antarctic station. And somehow we can discuss on those possibilities. But those issues that I raised was in 2021 June, before the Ukraine war. According to my view, tentatively, I don't think there are any fundamental changes in those challenges that I expressed 1.5 years ago after the Ukraine war. I think the nature of the challenges are the same, and we have to address all of them together. And the last point that I mentioned during that symposium was, what is the core Japanese interest in Antarctic governance after retreating from Antarctic whaling? And that is not clear. And I suggested that towards the 2026, maybe Japan can express its Antarctic policy, like Japan did for the Arctic policy in 2015. All right, so coming back to the two issues that I deferred, the first one is the consultative party status acknowledgement. As you can see from the report of the Berlin meeting, there will be an agenda item coming up for Finnish host in 2026. This is the request from Belarus to become the consultative party, together with the request from Canada to become a consultative party. This will be a very challenging issue for Finnish host. Ukraine war, as you can see from the names of the countries, Ukraine war is directly complicating this matter. Of course, this requires immediate consideration. However, according to my view, it needs it has a great precedential significance for the overall Antarctic governance and in the long term. So according to my view, it should be dealt with very, very carefully. According to my view, both the Belarus and Canada do satisfy the criteria to be acknowledged as the consultative party. Belarus has its station in Antarctica, whereas Canada does not have such facilities in Antarctica, but they have done a lot of Antarctic research, including satellite observation, for example. Very different types of Antarctic researches. However, according to my view, objectively, they do qualify for the consultative party status. But of course, this would be the case for the consultative parties to apply Article 9, Paragraph 2, And according to that provision, it is the entitlement of the contractor party who have demonstrated the substantial research there meaning in Antarctica. And this criteria, according to my view, should never be politicized in its application. It has to be an objective, factual determination, acknowledgement, and then the decision to acknowledge the consultative party status should be a kind of a formal process. And it should never become something like the United Nations admission process, in which, for example, Japan was not able to become the UN member because of the Soviet Union veto in 1950s. The next issue that I would like to go a little bit deeper is the science-based decision-making in the ATS. And from the Berlin meeting, the final report, you can see at least two issues that have involved this science-based decision-making and the difficulties of that. And one was the climate change response work program, which Professor Koivrova has already mentioned. The other one is the designation of emperor penguins for the specially protected species. And I will take up the latter case as an example of what has happened and what can we do as academia. So you can see those two cases are not involving Russia. Those are Chinese issues. But somehow this acrimonious meeting atmosphere at the Berlin might have exacerbated this kind of controversy regarding these issues. And this is those cases are scientific objections juxtaposed or maybe abused with procedural legitimacy. When I say procedural legitimacy, it is the work methods of the Committee of Environmental Protection, CEP, and SCAR. Let me go a little bit deeper into them. So any future insights from Emperor Penguin case? And I have highlighted one article from Nature in 2016. And this is very serious matter that we hear a lot of frustrations from Antarctic scientists that their science has not been taken up by the governance people, and that they have expressed their increasingly decreasing confidence in Antarctic governance under the ATS. This, I think, is a very, very serious matter where we, the academia, and also policymakers should address very carefully and immediately. I will not go into all the information that I have shown on my slide with regard to the Chinese position on this one, the designation of emperor penguin for the specially protected areas. They are all from the final reports and the documents. But I would just mention in 2021, there was some kind of precursor to this one. If you look at Chinese working paper 57, they mentioned specifically with regard to Ross Sea area, and working paper 58, they argued about the science to inform Antarctic decision-making regarding protected area system. So it's different from specially protected species, but they have raised this issue with regard to the protected area system. And again, I will not go into the details of how the other parties responded to the Chinese objection to it. They are all available on the reports and also the documents. But this process was a 2 to 3 year process. It's not a kind of a sudden proposal coming from the UK. They have already raised this issue in 2019, and they built up the science in 2021, and they actually made a policy proposal in 2022. So it was a 3-year process. But again, in Berlin, it was rejected because of the one objection, at least explicit objection from China. We do not know whether it was actually agreed upon by all the parties, but China was specifically mentioned as objecting to this proposal. And the evaluation, I mentioned unfortunate question mark, lesson to be learned. Let me provide you my evaluation of this case. In my view, there can be a certain degree of sympathy accepted for Chinese opposition based on formal and written rules, which might have led China to consider that emperor penguin's designation for the specially protected species would have required more discrete policy-related discussions. These policy-related discussions behind this proposal were, first, the use of IUCN Red List as a primary but not exclusive criteria for the designation, and second, how far the potential and future adverse effects of climate change in Antarctica would actually be taken into account in the present-day environmental management tools under the protocol. Both are very relevant topics for policy discussions in CEP and ATCM. However, unfortunately, according to my view, China presented these concerns first as an attack against the credibility of SCAR's scientific advice, and second, as an inflexible, formalistic objection based only on the written procedural rules, instead of taking into account a practice-based evolution of the way that CEP and SCAR improve their work methods. In this regard, it was again unfortunate, according to my view, that China seemed to miss the lessons that SCAR and the CEP members themselves learned through the case of southern giant petrels from 2006 to 2008, finalizing in the 2008 workshop, reported in SCAR Working Paper 10, 2008. It should be noted that Chinese Working Paper 24 in 2022 does not mention this document. Substantively, it should be noted that there would be no significant additional regulations imposed by this designation under Annex 2, namely, permits to take them only for compelling scientific purposes. The proposed action plan does not in substance impose any stricter regulations. This designation is rather a symbolic gesture of the ATCM in responding to the climate change using an iconic animal in the Antarctic. In addition, the designation and the draft action plan do not seem to directly implicate negatively Chinese activities, including fisheries activities. It should, however, be noted that the Chinese activities, the Chinese paper submitted in 2021, which I mentioned in my earlier intervention, on emperor penguins, was on the basis of their assessment of penguin populations in the Ross Sea area, a politically sensitive area for China because of its fifth station being built in the region and the continuing problems relating to the implementation of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. This is from the Kamura issue. In the draft action plan, there is a certain remote link suggested between the designation and the proposed MPA in Kamura, but could not, according to my view, be considered as an immediate concern for China. All are speculative, but online and hybrid meetings might have made frank dialogue difficult, and there seem to be some lessons needed to be learned from this case on both sides of the controversy. So thank you very much. I think I have used up all my time, and this is Adelie penguins, not the emperor penguins, from Antarctica when I was staying near the Showa station in 2016 to 2017. All right, thank you very much.